The laboratory smelled of chemical reagents and possibility. Dr. James Mitchell carefully measured precisely 3.7 milliliters of his experimental compound into a glass beaker, watching the clear liquid catch the fluorescent light. Outside his lab window at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a formation of F-86 Sabre jets screamed past, their pilots depending on oxygen systems that were killing them at an alarming rate. 43 pilots dead in the past 18 months. Not from combat, not from mechanical failure, but from a chemical reaction that nobody understood. High-altitude oxygen systems were supposed to keep pilots alive above 20,000 feet. Instead, under certain conditions, the pure oxygen reacted with materials in the delivery system, creating toxic compounds that poisoned the very men the system was designed to protect. The Air Force had the best engineers in the world working on the problem. None of them had solved it. Now they had turned to James Mitchell, a 42-year-old chemist who wasn't supposed to be there at all. James had earned his doctorate in chemistry from Howard University in 1938, graduating top of his class with research that had impressed even his skeptical professors. But in 1938 America, a black chemist with a doctorate had limited options. Industry labs wouldn't hire him. Universities offered only positions as janitors or lab assistants, never researchers. He had spent 5 years teaching high school chemistry in Washington, D.C., watching white students with half his qualifications move into careers he could only dream about. World War II had changed everything, temporarily at least. Desperate for scientists to support the war effort, the government had begun recruiting from previously excluded populations. James had been brought to Wright-Patterson in 1943 as a junior chemist, assigned to mundane tasks like testing fuel samples and analyzing lubricants. His supervisors had made clear he was there on sufferance, that his position would disappear the moment the war ended. But James had proven himself through work that couldn't be denied. His analysis of aviation fuel contamination had saved dozens of aircraft from engine failure. His modifications to antifreeze formulas had kept bombers flying in Arctic conditions. Slowly, grudgingly, his white colleagues had begun to respect his abilities, if not his presence. When the oxygen system crisis emerged in 1951, the chief of aviation chemistry had done something unprecedented. He had assigned James as lead researcher on the problem. The assignment had come with explicit conditions. James would work alone in a separate laboratory. His findings would be reported through intermediaries. His name would not appear on any official documents. These conditions were presented not as punishment, but as practical necessity. In 1952, the military was still segregated in practice, if not in policy. The idea of a black chemist receiving credit for solving a problem that white scientists would create political complications the Pentagon wanted to avoid. James had accepted the conditions because the alternative was being removed from the project entirely. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when men were dying. So he worked alone in his laboratory, pursuing a solution that had eluded every other researcher who had examined the problem. The issue was oxidation. Pure oxygen at high pressure was extraordinarily reactive, attacking rubber seals, plastic tubing, and metal fittings in the oxygen delivery system. These reactions created toxic compounds that mixed with the breathing oxygen. Pilots would feel dizzy, disoriented, sometimes losing consciousness at altitudes where mistakes were instantly fatal. Several crashes have been attributed to pilot error, until autopsies revealed toxic chemical levels in the pilot's blood. Previous researchers had tried to solve the problem by changing materials in the oxygen system, finding rubbers that wouldn't oxidize, metals that wouldn't react, plastics that could withstand pure oxygen. These approaches had failed. There were fundamental limits to material science, and pure oxygen's reactivity exceeded those limits. James had taken a different approach. Instead of changing the materials, he would change the oxygen itself, not its chemical composition, that had to remain pure O2 to support breathing at high altitude, but its reactivity. He would create an additive that would passivate the oxygen, making it less aggressive toward the materials it contacted while maintaining its breathability. The compound he was developing combined organic molecules with specific metal ions in a carefully balanced formula. The organic molecules would create a protective coating on material surfaces, while the metal ions would moderate oxygen's reactivity. The challenge was creating something that worked without being toxic itself. that remained stable under pressure and temperature variations, and that didn't interfere with the oxygen's ability to support human respiration. He had been working on the formula for 7 months, testing hundreds of variations, each one failing in some critical way. Too toxic, too unstable, too reactive, ineffective at high pressure, degraded at low temperature. Every test revealed new problems. But James was methodical, documenting every failure, learning from each negative result, gradually narrowing the range of possible solutions. The compound in the beaker before him was variation 263. He had formulated it the previous evening after analyzing why variation 262 had degraded at high pressure. A slight modification to the molecular structure, a different ratio of metal ions, a change in the stabilizing agent. Small adjustments that might make no difference or might solve everything. James poured the compound into a high-pressure test chamber, sealed it, and began flooding the chamber with pure oxygen at pressures equivalent to 25,000 feet altitude. Inside the chamber sat samples of every material used in aircraft oxygen systems: rubber seals, plastic tubing, aluminum fittings, copper connectors. If his formula worked, these materials would show minimal oxidation after 24 hours of exposure. If it failed, they would show the same degradation that had plagued every previous attempt. The test would take a full day to complete. James locked the laboratory and went to cafeteria, where he ate alone at a table in the corner. The white chemists and engineers ate together at the large tables in the center of the room, their conversation loud and comfortable. Nobody invited James to join them. Nobody sat near him. This was normal, expected, the daily reality of being black in a white institution. 24 hours later, James stood before the test chamber with hands that trembled slightly as he prepared to open it. Everything he had worked toward for 7 months came down to this moment. He had barely slept, running calculations in his head, second-guessing molecular ratios, wondering if variation 263 would be just another failure in a long series of failures. The chamber hissed as he released the pressure, equalized it with normal atmosphere. James opened the access port and carefully removed the material samples, laying them on the examination table under bright light. His breath caught. The rubber seals showed no visible degradation. The plastic tubing maintained its flexibility and transparency. The metal fittings were free of the oxidation pitting that had characterized every previous test. He spent the next 6 hours conducting detailed analysis. Microscopic examination revealed minimal surface changes. Chemical testing showed toxicity levels well within acceptable ranges. Flexibility tests on the rubber and plastic demonstrated maintained structural integrity. Every measurement, every test, every analysis pointed to the same conclusion: variation 263 worked. James sat down slowly, the weight of success pressing down on him as heavily as failure ever had. He had solved it. 7 months of isolated work, 263 failed attempts, and now he held a solution to a problem that was killing American pilots. The formula was elegant in its simplicity, effective in its application, and ready for immediate implementation. He wrote his report that evening, documenting the formula, the testing procedures, and the results. Following the protocols he had been given, he submitted the report through his supervisor, Dr. Raymond Walsh, without his name attached. The document was labeled Solution to High-Altitude Oxygen System Contamination, Confidential Research Project 7734. Walsh called James into his office the following morning. The white chemist was in his 50s, a career Air Force scientist who had initially resented having a black researcher assigned to his department. But 7 months of watching James work had changed something in Walsh's perspective, if not his public behavior. "Mitchell, I've reviewed your findings," Walsh said. The report spread across his desk. "I've run verification tests overnight. Your formula works. It's exactly what we need." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is going to save lives. A lot of lives. You should know that." James nodded, waiting for what would come next. There was always something that came next. The Pentagon wanted to implement your formula immediately across all aircraft. Production begins within 30 days. Every oxygen system in the Air Force inventory will be treated with your compound within 6 months. Walsh looked uncomfortable now, not meeting James's eyes. Your name won't appear in any of the documentation. The official record will list this as developed by Project 7734 research team. No individual attribution. I understood those terms when I accepted the assignment. James replied quietly. His voice carried no bitterness, just acceptance of a reality he couldn't change. Walsh finally met his eyes. For what it's worth, Mitchell, you're the best chemist I've ever worked with. What you've accomplished here. Any researcher will be proud of it. I'm sorry the world won't know it was you. The formula went into immediate production at chemical plants in New Jersey and California. Military suppliers received specifications for the new oxygen system treatment, which they called Compound 7734 after the project designation. Within weeks, modified oxygen systems began appearing in fighter aircraft. Within months, every military aircraft in the American inventory had been retrofitted. The results were immediate and dramatic. Pilot deaths from oxygen system failure dropped to nearly zero. High-altitude missions that had been dangerous became routine. Fighter pilots who had feared their oxygen supply more than enemy fire could now focus entirely on their missions. Conservative estimates suggested the formula would save at least 10,000 lives over the coming decades of its use. At Wright-Patterson, James returned to his isolated laboratory and routine assignments testing fuel samples and analyzing lubricants. The oxygen system project was complete, his contribution was classified, and his role in saving thousands of lives remained known only to a handful of people bound by military secrecy. But word had a way of spreading despite official silence. Other black chemists and engineers working in military research heard rumors about James's work. They couldn't discuss it openly, couldn't acknowledge what he had done, but they knew. In the small community of African American scientists working within a system that barely tolerated their presence, James Mitchell became a quiet hero, proof that excellence couldn't be completely suppressed even by official policy. In 1954, a young black engineer named Robert Harris was assigned to Wright-Patterson. On his second day, an older maintenance technician pulled him aside. "You see that chemist working alone in Lab 7? That's Dr. Mitchell. He saved more pilots than any ace who ever flew. The Air Force won't tell you that, but it's true. You remember his name." The Korean War ended, but Compound 7734 continued its silent service. Fighter jets flying combat missions in Vietnam carried oxygen systems treated with James's formula. Pilots who never knew his name breathed safely at high altitude because of his work. The formula became so standard that younger engineers and chemists assumed it had always existed, just another component in the complex systems that kept aircraft flying. James continued working at Wright-Patterson through the 1950s and into the 1960s. His research assignments gradually improved as the Air Force slowly, reluctantly began integrating its scientific workforce. He was eventually allowed to put his name on some of his less significant research papers. He presented findings at internal conferences where he was often the only black scientist in the room. Progress came in tiny increments, each one requiring more effort than it should have. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination in federal employment. The change in law didn't immediately change culture, but it opened doors that had been locked. James was promoted to senior research chemist and given his own research team. For the first time in his career, his name appeared on official project assignments. But his most important work, the oxygen system formula that was saving lives every day, remained classified and unattributed. He retired in 1972 at age 62, after 29 years at Wright-Patterson. The retirement ceremony was small and formal, with the standard presentations and speeches. Nobody mentioned Compound 7734. Nobody acknowledged that thousands of pilots owed their lives to the man receiving a standard retirement plaque. James accepted the recognition for his visible work and said nothing about what had been hidden. The formula continued in service long after James's retirement. It was so effective that it became the standard not just for military aircraft, but for civilian aviation as well. Commercial airlines adopted modified versions for their high-altitude oxygen systems. Space programs incorporated principles from James's work into their life support systems. The applications expanded far beyond what anyone had anticipated in 1952. The decades passed, and James Mitchell lived quietly in retirement, teaching occasional chemistry classes at a local community college and tending his garden. His wife, Martha, a schoolteacher he had married in 1945, was the only person outside the military who knew the full story of his work. She had watched him come home exhausted night after night during those 7 months in 1952, had listened to his frustrations about failed experiments, and had celebrated privately when he finally succeeded. "It bothers you, doesn't it?" Martha asked one evening in 1985 as they sat on their porch. James had been reading a magazine article about advances in aviation safety that mentioned oxygen system improvements without any attribution, that nobody knows what you did. James considered the question carefully. "Sometimes, not for my ego, I made peace with anonymity a long time ago. But I think about the young black scientists and engineers coming up now. They need to see that people who look like them have made contributions that matter. They need heroes who aren't just athletes or entertainers. When my story stays buried, it's not just my recognition that's lost. It's inspiration for others." Martha squeezed his hand. "Maybe someday they'll tell the truth. The Cold War won't last forever. When the secrecy ends, your story will come out." But the Cold War ended in 1991, and James's story remained classified. The formula itself was eventually declassified as newer technologies replaced it, but the attribution remained buried in restricted files. Compound 7734 was listed in declassified documents as developed by Air Force Research Team, 1952, with no individual names mentioned. The pattern of institutional erasure continued long after the original security justifications had disappeared. In 1992, a military historian named Dr. Patricia Chambers was researching the development of aviation safety systems for a book she was writing. She had obtained declassified files about oxygen system improvements and noticed something odd in the documentation. Project 7734 had been assigned to Dr. Raymond Walsh's chemistry section, but Walsh himself had published nothing about oxygen systems. His area of expertise was fuel chemistry, not life support systems. Someone else had done the actual work. Chambers began investigating, following the bureaucratic paper trail through archives at Wright-Patterson. She found budget allocations for a separate laboratory space in 1952. She found supply requisitions signed by someone other than Walsh. She found internal memos referencing Mitchell's laboratory and Mitchell's experiments. Slowly, she pieced together the existence of a researcher whose name had been systematically excluded from official records. Finding James Mitchell himself took another year of research. He wasn't listed in any of the official project documentation, but Chambers eventually located him through retirement records. In the summer of 1993, she called a phone number in Dayton, Ohio, and asked to speak with Dr. James Mitchell about his work at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then James's voice, now aged but still sharp. "Who told you about my work?" "Nobody told me. I found the gaps in the records and followed them backward until I found you. Dr. Mitchell, I'm writing a book about aviation safety developments, and I believe you developed Compound 7734. Is that correct?" Another silence. James was weighing decades of enforced secrecy against the possibility of finally having his contribution acknowledged. "Yes, I developed that formula in 1952. It took me 7 months and 263 failed attempts to get it right." Chambers flew to Dayton the following week. She spent 3 days interviewing James, documenting his education, his career, his work on the oxygen system problem, and the conditions under which he had been required to work. James showed her his personal notebooks from 1952, which he had kept despite regulations requiring all research documentation to remain at the facility. The notebooks contained detailed records of every experiment, every failed attempt, every adjustment that had finally led to success. "Why did you keep these?" Chambers asked, carefully photographing the notebook pages. "You could have been court-martialed for removing classified materials." James smiled slightly. "I knew that someday someone would ask questions. I wanted to be able to prove what I had done. And these notebooks aren't classified. They're my personal work notes." The classification applied to the final formula in the official reports, not to my own records of the research process. Armed with James's testimony and documentation, Chambers began pressing the Air Force to acknowledge his contribution. She submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for complete Project 7734 files. She contacted the Air Force Historical Research Agency. She wrote letters to senators and congressmen. The bureaucratic response was consistent. The information was still considered sensitive. Full disclosure was not in the public interest, and the Air Force stood by its official records. But times were changing. The early 1990s saw a growing attention to previously unrecognized contributions by minorities in American history. The Tuskegee Airmen were finally receiving proper recognition. Hidden Figures would eventually tell the story of black women mathematicians at NASA. The cultural moment was shifting toward acknowledgement rather than continued suppression. In 1994, Representative Eleanor Norton from Washington, D.C. read Chambers' research and took up the cause. She introduced a resolution in Congress calling on the Department of Defense to review and correct historical records that had excluded African-American scientists from proper attribution. The resolution specifically mentioned Project 7734 and Drive James Mitchell. The Pentagon resisted initially, citing concerns about setting precedents and opening up thousands of similar claims. But the public relations cost of continuing to suppress the story became untenable. In January 1995, the Secretary of the Air Force announced a review of Project 7734 documentation to determine proper attribution. The review took 8 months. Investigators interviewed surviving personnel from Wright-Patterson in the 1950s. They examined budget records, laboratory assignments, and internal communications. They compared James's personal notebooks with declassified technical reports and confirmed that the formulas matched precisely. In September 1995, the Air Force issued an official statement acknowledging that Dr. James Mitchell had been the principal researcher who developed Compound 7734. The announcement made front-page news in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Aviation publications ran detailed stories about the formula that had saved thousands of lives and the chemist whose contribution had been hidden for 43 years. James, now 85 years old, found himself suddenly famous for work he had done when he was 42. CBS Evening News sent a crew to Dayton to interview him. James sat in his living room, surrounded by his family, finally able to tell the story he had been prohibited from sharing for 4 decades. I did the work because pilots were dying and I had the skills to help. The recognition wasn't important then. But I'm glad the truth is finally known, not for me so much as for all the other black scientists whose contributions have been hidden or minimized. We were there, we did the work, and we made a difference. The Air Force invited James to a ceremony at Wright-Patterson, where he would receive belated recognition for his work. In November 1995, wearing his best suit, James stood in the same laboratory where he conducted his research 43 years earlier. The laboratory had been updated and modernized, but the basic layout remained the same. He could still see where his test equipment had been positioned, where he had carefully measured out variation 263. The ceremony drew more attention than the Air Force had anticipated. Representatives from aviation organizations attended, along with retired pilots whose lives had been saved by James's formula. Several of these pilots asked to meet him personally, to shake the hand of the man whose work had kept him alive at 30,000 feet over hostile territory. Colonel Richard Hayes, retired, approached James with tears in his eyes. Dr. Mitchell, I flew F-80XS in Korea. Lost 2 friends' oxygen system failures before your compound was implemented. After the retrofit, never had another problem. I flew 300 missions at high altitude without incident. I'm 72 years old now, got 6 grandchildren. They exist because you figured out how to keep their grandfather breathing. James listened to story after story from pilots he had never met, men whose lives he had saved without knowing their names. Each conversation reinforced what Martha had told him decades ago. His work had mattered. The recognition was nice, but the knowledge that his formula had actually done what it was designed to do, that thousands of people had lived because of his chemistry, that was the real reward. The Air Force presented James with the Decoration for Exceptional Civilian Service, their highest civilian honor. General Thomas Morrison, who presented the award, acknowledged the injustice explicitly. Dr. Mitchell, your contribution should have been recognized in 1952. The fact that it wasn't represents a failure of the institution to live up to its own values. We cannot change the past, but we can ensure the historical record is corrected and that your achievement is properly acknowledged. The ceremony included a technical presentation about Compound 7734 and its impact on aviation safety. Air Force historians had calculated that the formula had been in service on over 50,000 aircraft during its 43 years of active use. Conservative estimates suggested it had prevented at least 12,000 oxygen system failures that would likely have resulted in pilot deaths. The actual number might be significantly higher, as many incidents were prevented before they became dangerous enough to be recorded. Dr. Patricia Chambers attended the ceremony and presented James with the first copy of her book, Breathing at Altitude, The Untold Story of Aviation Life Support Systems, which devoted an entire chapter to his work. The book would go on to win awards and become required reading in aerospace engineering programs. James's story became a case study not just in chemistry, but in the social history of science and technology. Universities began inviting James to speak about his experiences. Despite his age, he accepted several invitations, particularly at historically black colleges and universities where he knew his story would resonate with students facing their own barriers. At Howard University, his alma mater, he spoke to a packed auditorium of chemistry students. I was told I couldn't do the work because of my race, James told them, his voice still strong despite his 85 years. I was told I could do the work, but couldn't receive credit because of my race. I did the work anyway, because the work itself mattered more than recognition. But I want you to understand something. You deserve both. You deserve to do meaningful work, and you deserve to receive credit for it. Don't accept the limitations that others try to impose. And don't let anyone tell you that science is colorblind. Science itself might be, but the institutions that practice science certainly aren't. You'll face obstacles I face and obstacles I never imagined. Face them, overcome them, and make sure the next generation faces fewer obstacles than you did. The speech received a standing ovation. Several students approached James afterward to thank him and to share their own experiences with discrimination in academic settings. One young woman, a doctoral candidate in organic chemistry, told him she had been ready to quit her program until she learned about his story. If you could persist through what you faced, I can persist through what I'm facing. Thank you for showing me that's possible. James lived to see his formula finally phase out of service in the late 1990s as new oxygen system technologies replaced the older systems entirely. By that time, Compound 7734 had been in continuous use for 46 years, an extraordinary lifespan for any aviation technology. The National Air and Space Museum requested samples of the original compound and James's laboratory notebooks for their collection, preserving them as important artifacts in aviation history. In 1998, the Black Engineer of the Year Awards created a new category specifically honoring historic contributions that had been previously unrecognized. James was the first recipient. During the acceptance speech, he emphasized something he wanted people to understand. I wasn't the only black scientist doing important work that went unrecognized. I was one of hundreds, probably thousands. My story got told because a determined historian refused to accept the gaps in the record. How many other stories remain untold? How many other contributions remain unacknowledged? We need to dig deeper into our archives, question our official histories, and uncover all the hidden figures who build our modern world. His words sparked a movement within scientific organizations to review historical records for excluded contributions. Several professional societies established committees to investigate attribution in their fields. The American Chemical Society commissioned a comprehensive study of African American chemists whose work had been minimized or unattributed. James served as an advisor to this project, helping researchers understand the bureaucratic and social mechanisms that had enabled systematic exclusion. Martha passed away in 1999, and James felt her loss deeply. She had been a supporter through all the difficult years, the only person who had shared the burden of his hidden achievement. At her funeral, he spoke about her role in his success. My wife knew what I had done when the world didn't. She knew the value of my work when it couldn't be acknowledged. Her belief in me never wavered, even when I doubted myself. The recognition I've received these past few years, she deserved to share it. She earned it as much as I did. James continued teaching occasional classes and giving interviews until 2001, when his health began to decline. He passed away peacefully in 2002 at the age of 92, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary appeared in major newspapers across the country, finally giving him the public recognition that had been denied during most of his life. The Air Force renamed the chemistry laboratory at Wright-Patterson in his honor. The James Mitchell Laboratory for Aerospace Chemistry became a symbol of the institution's commitment to acknowledging all contributors to its mission, regardless of race. Young chemists and engineers working there learned about the man whose name was on the building, about what he had accomplished, and about why his story had been hidden for so long. Universities began including James's story in their chemistry and engineering curricula, not just as a scientific achievement, but as a case study in the sociology of science. His experience illustrated how institutional racism had suppressed contributions and denied recognition, but also how persistence and excellence could eventually overcome those barriers. His notebooks became teaching tools, showing students the process of systematic experimentation and the persistence required to solve difficult problems. The formula itself, though no longer in active service, remained part of aviation history. Engineers studying the evolution of life support systems still reference compound 7734 as a breakthrough that had enabled reliable high-altitude flight. The principles James had developed, using chemical additives to moderate oxygen reactivity while maintaining breathability, influenced subsequent generations of life support technology, including systems used in spacecraft and deep-sea diving equipment. In 2012, on the 60th anniversary of James's original breakthrough, the Air Force held a commemorative symposium on aviation safety. Speakers included aerospace engineers, military historians, and several of James's former students from his community college teaching days. They discussed not just the technical aspects of his achievement, but its broader significance in American history. Dr. Robert Harris, the young engineer who had been told to remember James's name back in 1954, was the keynote speaker. Now retired himself, Harris spoke about the impact of James's hidden heroism on a generation of black scientists and engineers. We knew about Dr. Mitchell long before the Air Force officially acknowledged him. His story circulated among us, whispered in laboratories and workshops, told to new hires as inspiration. We knew that if he could do groundbreaking work under those conditions, we could persevere through our own challenges. He was our secret hero for 40 years before he became a public one. The symposium concluded with the unveiling of a memorial in the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Museum. The exhibit featured James's original laboratory notebooks, samples of compound 7734, photographs from his career, and testimonials from pilots whose lives his formula had saved. The centerpiece was a quote from James himself. "Science belongs to everyone who practices it. Truth doesn't care about the color of the person who discovers it, but institutions do care. And that's why we must constantly fight to ensure that recognition matches contribution." Today, James Mitchell's story is taught in schools and featured in documentaries about hidden scientific heroes. His name appears alongside other African-American scientists like George Washington Carver, Percy Julian, and Mae Jemison, people who made fundamental contributions despite facing systematic exclusion. But James's story carries an additional message. Sometimes the most important recognition comes not during one's lifetime, but in the correction of the historical record for future generations. The pilots he saved never knew his name while they flew their missions. The engineers who implemented his formula never acknowledged his contribution. The institution he served kept him in the shadows for 40 years. But in the end, truth emerged. The hidden chemist whose formula saved 10,000 lives finally received his place in history, and his story became a testament to both the persistence of injustice and the eventual power of truth to overcome it. For 40 years, the Pentagon kept James Mitchell's name secret, but they couldn't erase what he accomplished. His story reminds us that history is often incomplete, that heroes are sometimes hidden, and that we must constantly question official narratives to uncover the truth. If stories like this matter to you, Stories of people who changed the world despite being denied recognition. Subscribe to our channel. History isn't just about the famous names everyone knows. Sometimes it's about the names that were deliberately forgotten but deserve to be remembered.